Hello everyone, today we talk about Indo-European theology and the sound P as connected with the fact purification. Alright, this is very much ingrained in our language, not just in meaning, but in the actual sound. We already made enough Indo-European theology videos to, as a whole series, to entwine this entire, in fact, tapestry, like of celestial, cosmic meaning. So let's get to it, because the word really was never anything in this theological view but one single slow breathing act. We've seen it also with the sound H, all right, that expresses this pneumatic understanding of the insufflation of life, but a breathing act of purification as well, and specifically. And as we've seen, by the way, and I say it every time in this series, is that the meaning, the different meaning attached to different sounds is just a shade of a universal, overarching, in this sense, unitary meaning, all right? It's not what we're habituated to think, just like in history of religions, we think this was polytheism because we think that, as a matter of fact, this is not just the hypostatization of a higher principle, as opposed to, different characters like in a novel. And this is really heavily disturbing that, namely adult people literally do not know this from our educational systems. It's really embarrassing, for not talking about the complete absence of awareness, even methodologically speaking, sometimes, even among those who study Indo-Europeistics, both from in fact, in different ways. It can be just religious, it can be just linguistic. Obviously, things tend to collimate, but it's difficult sometimes, like to find, a specialist in mythology that, however, has actually studied religion through his curriculum in his career in a way that is conducive to an overarching understanding. Actually, some of these concepts are even dismissed not much by them, but by people in general, because the skepticistic, defeatistic mentality that emerged especially from the 1970s, 1960s onward, tells us, well, if something is not literally like scripted in a formally explicit sense, right, it's too much work to actually realize that you can recompose it from the wall, right? It must not be there. But that's literally how most people are specifically trained to think, right? And do not move, really, also because of hyper-specialization of all the drama of our academic world. In any case, in this breathing act of purification discussed today, so every drop that fell from cloud or eye, every spark that ever leapt from flint or heart, every syllable that ever passed human lips was only another wave in the same tide that began with the primordial waters that we've seen in the video about the Na were first named. All right. Now, you realize this P sound in, for example, the Sanskrit Ap, that is water, river. The first Eastern light was also named like this Purva from the Proto-Indo-European, because also the Ap is from Proto-Indo-European Hep, and Purva is from the Proto-Indo-European Purva, which means first, foremost, because remember, the videos we've made will come back also in the role of femininity, of the feminine in an archetypal, theological, metaphysical sense, is like the womb, the place of inception of divinity, that naturally comes from the above, but truly is, in fact, birthing its own mother, but being birthed by, in fact, the mother as well. This could not sort of exist without such compenetration. And the metaphors we used before are not random, because the cloud or the eye are exactly celestial, providential symbols, right? The cloud, as we've seen also in the video about Agni, to thunder, the thing about Jupiter, the tonans, right? The idea is that the Godfather controls also the elements in their chthonic dimension, so the water. The eye can be theory, but in that sense, the eye is the eye of the soul and the one of providence from which sort of the molding of the world emanates, right? So either flint or heart, so that a spark proper that can emerge from our heart, that can, according to the Indo-European theological understanding of love, can at some point from this tiny barley grain-sized sort of part of your soul can come to encompass the entire universe. Really, the process of purification takes place, because we've seen also recently in that video about the Hermetic tradition, about Luna, about the moon, about Artemis, as a matter of fact, that we have also seen in that recent video about the Olympians, even though you would say, well, Apollo, Zeus, Athena, well, we understand why they are Olympian, including Athena as a female that is, however, the transfigured soul of the hero, right? So bringing you to heaven. But what about Artemis? She's actually very chtonically loaded in meaning. Well, the same reason why you see the iconography of the Virgin in Catholicism standing over the crescent, right? That was powerfully used, as you know, during the Renaissance, also in terms of, crushing the Ottomans through crusading God-guided efforts. But that has a very ancient meaning. And it's not much just like the more universal symbology of the crescent, that for that matter was also used by the Ottomans, but it was a very old thing. The Byzantines had used it, the Romans had used it even before, everyone, the Carthaginians, the Sumerians, right? Because it represents the rise, the rebooting of the cycle, but from the darkness, right? But it is in this sense, in fact, just like the moon, and in the myth of the Rex Nemorensis, the woman living in the forest, just like Artemis. So it's the queen of the forest that is possessed by man, that in this sense reinvigorates the forest, the oak of the world with golden fruits, hence the myth of the Hesperides, Hercules, and so on. This was present in all Indo-European populations, as you know, and beyond, like the same Bible, for example, had very universally sort of shared principles, in fact, a truly universal tradition. Well, all this occurred through the purification of the most chthonic element par excellence, that is to say, the abyss, water, right? And again, we've seen this also in the video about nada, is the N sound in the Indo-European languages that is deeply connected with the same water, all right, the primordial water. The sound P in Indo-European languages has to do with the purification of this water. In fact, the same term purification in English, coming from Latin, derives from this root phoneme that now we're going to analyze better. So remember, ap, water, river, purva, first, foremost, if we stick to the Vedic sources. In fact, in the Rig Veda, the cosmic waters are repeatedly called ap. It's present in the Rig Veda 10:30-10-12. The same word then in Hittite becomes hapa, as a matter of fact. This is KUB 33-120-14, which is river, right? Which expresses also the eternal becoming, right? The heavens are fixed, water is perpetually in motion, right? As well as in Thocarian, be yap, which PQ 112A3, these are all the specific sort of literary references, like the inscriptions, tablets, and so on, where you can find the term used. This is all water entering the body, by the way. So this is something extremely interesting. We will understand now better from a metaphysical point of view. Water entering the body, in this sense, does purify, but also must purify by the same body. All right, so it's cathartic mechanism. The eastern direction, as we've seen with Purva, is already present in the Satapatha Brahmana, 1.538, as the quarter where the sun is born pure after bathing in the primordial sea, right? Because the sun rose from the sea, from the east, right? And so the sun itself went under such purificatory process, which is also symbolic, a bit just like in the Bible tells us, with Christ going to hell necessarily before resurrection, which is the destiny that every second soul of the body, so the true soul of the body, has to go under in order to be judged and to win, in order to win over death because of its worth, its deed, and achieve heaven, right? And so this sun routinely does this by also purifying itself after descent, right? So after the death, and to rise again. That's obviously the broader metaphysical principle here. Now, before the first man opened his eyes, the waters were already up, the opening of purity, literally the flowing that gods themselves used to wash the newborn cosmos clean of chaos with, right? That's also in Genesis, right? It's the primordial principle that, in a sense, allows God to achieve. That's why, in that sense, so the references across both the Old and the New Testament, the Spirit of God was above these waters, right? And Christ walks on waters. It's the same identical concept, because we know very well that the Christian tradition was already part of the great Catholic, that is, universal tradition of the ancient world. It was all the same identical religion, and people still do not understand wholly why that is the case. From those waters arose, in fact, the very first cool breath. Metaphorically intended, there are, as we'll see now, naturalistic parallels, but primarily we're talking about the spirit, the Hellenic suke, that literally has in the su that P root, right? In fact, this actually comes from the Indo-European bes, to blow, breathe. And born in the depths of purity. So this is more like a Geist, right, that emerges, however, from these waters. You have the Sanskrit apsu, from the Proto-Indo-European epsu, in the waters, meaning. And that same breath still rises from the sea at dawn, carrying the salt scent of the first morning. Because, as you know, waters of the oceans maintain the heat, right? And that's also why the climate next to the water is mitigated, because it has absorbed the divine essence that sort of emanates from it once again. The Hellenic suke is the breath soul that leaves the body at death as well. And so it is exactly the second soul we were talking about before, that there is the persona that dies, right? And then there is the second soul that has to make it. This is also, described, in fact, as such in the Iliad, 9:408, 409. I said probably the suke, all right? And it's the most important. And identical to the Old Norse fisa, the breath, and Lithuanian spesti, to blow gently, all descending from the same root that first named the cool exhalation rising from the purifying apsu, which is, I would like to point out, as we explain here, how that energy had gotten in there from purified water, right? The spirit exhales, literally, with the partially transfigured chthonic element attached to that. The purifying apsu, and this is an Akkadian loan apsu via Indo-Iranian as well, confirms this concept. So it's very beautiful to imagine even properly the ascension of the soul through heavens through this initial temporary returning to the abyss during the night, and then the resurrection, essentially. And especially at the sunrise, because here we can think of the sea, but as we'll see now, there is also just like a dawn mist where the heat of the sun brings all this fluid properly up, to rise up in the sky from the darkness of the night, right? And this is, you understand how both concepts are compenetrated, but how they all are organically tied to a single dynamic. where the rim of the sun first touched the edge of the world, that place was forever purva, the foremost, the firstborn of purity, the great east, right? That's also why historically the sepulchres, for example, the migration era when inhumation had taken over, were aligned, like with the dead facing the east, right? And back in the day, like every eastern horizon had, since the origin of the world, carried the same name in the blood and bone of the wandering clans. Also because actually there is a double, as we'll see in other videos, geographical direction, right, regarding the origin of the gods, probably in a global sense, at least the peoples that had come to rule as a sacred race, etc. But in any case, the place where the sun rose, obviously foremost in a spiritual, metaphysical sense, entailed the purification of the water from which the sun had risen, which is the birth of God, literally. Now, in Avestan, the east is named Avestan Paurua. You understand? I don't have to repeat it once again. I'll look the P here. It's however that, like that's what we're calling as a leitmotif of this single episode of the series, the relative phoneme. This is from the Yasna 116. In Old Persian, you have the Paruva. In Old Church Slavonic, Privu, first, as a matter of fact. This is really, again, beautiful because it's just like an inception. So, as you know, the salute, for example, in Ukrainian is that it comes from this idea of inception. And it's very beautiful that Inucha contains this initial idea of purification of a new cycle ushered in by the birth of God, and so the rebooting of the world, the golden age itself. In Gaulish, the morning god is Uxoperantios, he who sees the first light, all preserving, in fact, the same Proto-Indo-European stem, purvo, right? Men rose while the great bears still wheeled low, poured the flowing ap tree, times over head, breast, and feet, speaking softly Sanskrit trisnana from the Proto-Indo-European root trisne, thrice flowing. Remember that. It's always the Trinity everywhere, right? But still, it's particularly relevant that the same sign of the cross stems from this older ritual of a triple blessing for obviously the Son, the Father, and the Holy Ghost. And it's that old as you can understand here from the etymology. Felt also the night clinging that slide away like a soiled garment. The man involved drank from cupped hands, for to drink is Sanskrit pa, from Proto-European pe, to protect, to guard, to protect the body and soul by filling the innermost shrine with purity, with the soma, as a matter of fact. This was done by actual ingestion. Obviously, it can't be understood in a metaphorical sense, but it was actually done through the sacred. It's just like, the wine in the Eucharist. And so you can appreciate that transubstantiation and drinking literally the blood of God that would infuse you naturally with the same divine character is very much at the center of European identity. And this is, of course, to be understood in a mystical sense, but this is, in fact, not just real, but hyper-real as such. Then the throat that swallowed water swallowed also the promise of life that does not end, just like exactly like in Catholic tradition. Now, the Vedic verb pati, that is, he guards, he gives drink, from the Rig Veda 10, 9, 1, 2, 3, yields the Latin pastor, herdsman, right? So this is very important, as you know, in the symbology, not just of Christ, but also the same Apollo before him. So the shepherd that literally guides the soul, because he guards this entire the entire world, and he is the one who offers the soma, right? Who through leadership nurtures his flock, right? It is also valid for the Latin pabulum, that is fodder, that gives you the idea of the feeding. The Hellenic potter, which is cup-bearer, hence potable, by the way, and so drinkable. The Armenian holvanu, which means patron, and the Old Irish verb for drinks pibeti, all from the same root that originally meant to keep safe by filling with pure liquid, all right, which is obviously a matter of through the birth of a new life, spiritually speaking, in an inceptional sense. Now, the father who kindled the new fire from yesterday's embers was the Sanskrit Peter. So, literally, our concept of fatherhood comes from this, right? So, the P3 from the Indo-European father, he who keeps the fire alive, that, as we've seen, also in the patrician, in fact, rituals was, maintained properly the household through the replication of the sacred rites and the fireplace, the earth, all right? This is incredibly important because during the rites, also the sacrificial offering was given in this form of also liquid. So in other words, he who makes pure without ceasing, because the continuity of the rite was exactly the continuity, the struggle, right, of the eternally living, the eternally rising as the king of the living, because naturally he who is in the retinue of the sacred ruler is only and truly alive through this bond, right? And remember, this is he who struggles in this dimension that is distant from both God and man, because it has to bring everything together, back together into the one. And we've seen this also in Caesar's Fortuna theology that he developed exactly to also affirm the fixing of the sacred res publica, of the chosen people by God. The son who stood beside, learning every gesture of the father, was the Sanskrit putra, from the Indo-European root putro, that is protector of the fire as well, guardian of the pure flame. The priest who walked from earth to earth at dawn carrying the flame in an earthen bowl was the Sanskrit hotari from the Indo-European gutar, that is poor awakener, because this fire was originally like the fire of the people, of the nation, was distributed, right, from the sacred center to all the earth, right, that proceeded in this hierarchical cooperative order, right, of rank. This was the awakener of purity, right, the Lord. And so we understand also the role of the priesthood that initially was literally in the hands of the same rulers, right, before the common era where the decision was created also, but the functions were distinct historically at least. The Lord who ruled over house, clan, and warband was the Sanskrit Pati, in fact. Indo-European pot is Lord of the earth, the purifier Lord, because only the pure hand may hold the scepter the gods acknowledge. Remember that he who does not have power is not in this condition because of somebody else's fault. This is completely alien to Indo-European theology. The fault is entirely his own for that, right? And if you're not God yourself, you're always at fault for some reason. So for those people who believe in conspiracy theories or just think that guilt is an alien concept to Indo-European spirit, it's actually much stronger in that sense than in any other place, exactly because it had to be averted, because people didn't have one. The same pot yields the Avestan pietis, that is master, the old Persian Pati, the Hittite Pater, priest king, and Luvian Patanza, that is ruler. This all preserves the original meaning, as you understand, of the man who maintains the household fire and thus purity. His wife was the Sanskrit Patni, right? Referring to European Patni, lady of the hearth. You understand here the root composition, etymologically speaking, pot, so the the earth is purified here, paternal authority, right, of fire. So the male sort of godfather, and Ni, which as we've seen is the actual female, it's femininity incarnated. So she is here the woman properly tied to the man as an element of his that allows him to in fact achieve same divinity. The lady of purity, if you wonder, the angel-like woman of the Minnesänger in the still novel is in the Ghibelline tradition is exactly the same thing. Is transfigured soul, is Athena, is Victoria, and the house itself was kept in the same cleanness as the altar by the woman. For the earth fire was the same fire that burned upon the altar of the gods. It had to remain perfectly immune, right? The same Potni is directly continued in the Luvian Patanza E, that is queen, lady. In Gaulish, you have names such as Epopatni, that is horse lady, and in the British Celtic is Old Welsh pen, Old Breton, same pen, head chief, right? Those are other compound of head lord, Kenopotni, right, as well. So this included essentially in the concept the fact that he only was established as an affirmed ruler hand seized again the woman, the lady, the feminine principle had subjugated, tamed, possessed it, could wield power, could wield the scepter of the world. And in Insular Celtic, the original word was eventually replaced relatively early by periphrastic expressions such as the Old Irish Kate Muinter, first of the household, but properly referred to the woman, right? And so it's like in the matrimony, it's like the matrona in the Roman world, the idea that that sphere pertains to the woman because it's the inner one, the darker one, if you want, whereas the man has to act outside and, in that sense, controlling of others, right? Whereas his core is also safeguarded by the same wife. In fact, Kele, again, just for Old Irish, which means companion, spouse. In Tocharian B, you find Patsi, which is wife, all directly inherited from the Proto-Indo-European root word. Again, you understand how important the paternal root as well associated with the concept of purification and the earth, the fire really is. It's a bit like the virgin vessels have that specific idea in Rome that the sacred fire of Rome could be entrusted to Roman women because they were so virtuous that Rome had in that example properly showed the world how they had fully tamed the feminine principle to entrust it such the top element, right, of romantic sacred fire. Nothing entered the body until it had first been turned in the purifying circle. Raw flesh was placed upon the turning spit. Sanskrit pak, literally from the Proto-Indo-European pek, which means to cook, to ripen, the circling motion that makes pure. In fact, that's how it was basically cooked, right, through the same fire. Equally, the grain was crushed beneath the stone. In Sanskrit, you have pish, from the Proto-Indo-European paste, to pound, to grind. The grinding that separates white earth from husk, from wheat from the chaff, it comes from exactly the same concept. We've seen in the video about probably the root word K, this circular movement was also not strange, like it mimicked the broader cosmic order, right, that gravitated towards the center, like in this instruments of the kitchen, so to say. The sacred soma stalk was pressed beneath the seated priest. In Sanskrit, ped, from Proto-Indo-European pay, to press, to squeeze. The pressure that forces purity to flow in a golden stream of the soma. That, remember, is also a pretty dangerous thing because if you're not ready to absorb it, it will actually burn you. All right, and hence that process itself is purificatory, as a matter of fact, just like the sacred pyre, like for the dead, because there was nothing to burn, but something to return to pure spirit in the cons. The root pek appears in the Latin coqua, by the way, because these changed also phonetically as the different Indo-European branches sort of distanciated themselves from the original. You have it in the Hellenic peso, the Armenian hovanu, the patron of cooking, also, and the Gothic hoa, plow, because plowing also ripens the earth in the same way. They all derive from that root word, right? If you look at the actual Proto-Indo-European roots, you understand even though they eventually were written and sounded in a slightly different way, it all comes from that, right, pek. Only when the offering had become Sanskrit, pakva, from the Proto-Indo-European peko, ripened by fire, was it divided. This is, in fact, the same principle of the sacrifice. As you know, this much you will have hopefully learned if you are from my class in primary school. One part rose as smoke to the gods, one part returned to men as strength. It was a fair deal, and it entailed the same process of purification through fire. Because they literally took also probably the flesh, the meat, and that was the process of the purification. That's why men could have that. It's not like in the story of because they gave just the smoke to the gods and that is not important. No, because as we've seen, the part properly elevating towards heaven was the most important one, and at the same time it reflected equally the importance now of the edible sacrifice. Right, that is always, as you understand here, a matter of ingestion as well, becomes your own, and in this sense makes you actually one with God in the same way. But you've told only the materialistic, desecrating version of the story, of course. Now, the fruit that hung heavy on the branch was already pakva, that is, sun-cooked, kissed by the same flame that arises in purva. To bite into it was to take the sun's purity into the blood, which is the same concept of the golden apple that we were talking about before. And it's something that remained. We just talked about the Melogran, like for the Holy Roman emperors, was the city of Granada, purified there by from the infidels by the conquest of the saint during the Holy War. All swelling, all bursting open, all prospering was Sanskrit push, from the Proto-Indo-European peo, to swell, to prosper. All right. So once you achieve that, you basically augmented even its value. The blue lotus Sanskrit pushkara, from the Proto-Indo-European root pushko, swelling one, rising unstained from mud, the child swelling in the womb, the barley field heavy with grain, the clan growing numerous under the smoke of pure offerings. Right, much of the symbolism is also connected with, as we've seen, the Indo-European view of the afterlife of heaven in Virgil's fourth eclogue in the Augustan era. Now, the same root gives the Avestan pusa, that is abundance, the Old Norse full, in fact, literally full, and the Lithuanian pusti, to blow up, to swell. Right, remember that. It comes, even some simple phrase like full, to fill, properly from this root word. You understand the sense of completion in it, right? To fulfill, even. It's sort of a double confirmation. The wind that scatters ripe seed across the earth was Sanskrit pavana, from the European moving purifier, because these are all little composites of the pe root plus a suffix, in this case the u, right? This would be the roaming purifier, right? The wind that, in this sense, comes from heaven to properly give the earthly dimension a higher value. The rain itself, that obviously fell from the purifying heavens, was the Latin pluvia, that literally stems from that. Jupiter pluvius, as we said before, was literally the one who ingravitated the earth. This is from the Proto-Indo-European plow, that is to flow, to rain. The strong flowing plow that washes the world clean and makes it ready for new birth. Right? The pepper grain, you would think, yes, that's also in Sanskrit, is pipali, from the Proto-Indo-European root pipali, little swelling one, because naturally we're talking the grain, the little purifier that bites and cleans the mouth, because that's how the pepper was used. We understand as a purifier, and it's actually correct, because the spices, as you know, have also an antiseptic kind of value. Salt and pepper together were called pipali lavana, and are the twin purifiers laid upon the tongue in the Vedic medical treatise. The pine as well, right? You understand how common all the root. You would wonder what is our vocabulary made of, right? In European language, it's literally made from these specific roots. The pine is in Sanskrit pitu daru, from the Proto-European pitu doru, which is a resin tree, but it is basically understood as somatic tree, as the gold tree. In fact, the doru, as a matter of fact, the Dorians themselves, just think about how many connections, the golden race that you find, in fact, in the myth about the originating the clans even of Sparta and so on. It's all from the same root. And in this case, the pine is the tree whose resin burns clean, just like the soma that is golden, and the fire itself, and whose needless fall to make the forest floor pure for the feet of the gods, right? At the basis properly of the tree. A beautiful image, by the way, naturalistically speaking. Now, the masculine itself is this sacred pums in Sanskrit, from the Proto-Indo-European to swelling in strength as a meaning, that which stands for forth in purity, as well as the male organ. As a matter of fact, the same phallus comes from this, in fact, aspersing with seed. And the male organ, in fact, in Sanskrit is pasas, from the Proto-Indo-European pasus, sprinkler, and that which must be kept clean for the sacred act of generation, in fact. So there's a higher concept of purity that has to do properly with the entire body there, in a spiritual sense, that properly has to provide with the greatest progeny, right? The foot was the Sanskrit pada. You understand how close it is to pedis in Latin, for example, from Proto-Indo-European root, in fact, pods, which is foot, in fact, for which the same foot in English also comes, like fus and so on, because it touches the earth more than any other part, and therefore gathers more dust, more death, right? It had to be washed again and again, so the walker might remain worthy to tread the path of the gods. If you wonder, why also like the broader religious sense of cleaning somebody's feet, like, why it's connected with impurity and purification in the process, like you definitely understand something more. You think these are basic hygienic precautions, but they still, this is the most important thing, they contain the root phoneme that's connected to the former, the absolute, the archetypal meaning that gives, in fact, meaning to the same part of the body, right? Because the description is not, okay, we call it like the foot like that for no reason. No, because it must be purified, because that's the reason why it was called like that. The same pods yields the Hellenic pos, Latin pes. Before I said pedis, but pedis is the footman, but in any case, the Gothic photos. As a matter of fact, there are many an oath. The Hittite pata, which is all foot, all preserving the original meaning of the limb that first touches the impure earth. Right, naturally, the limb of a divine being that doesn't have to be contaminated with the chthonic damage. We're talking humans as well. Now, the path itself was kept clean by the feet of the purified. In fact, the bridge over running water was the Latin pons, as we well know from the pontifex, that is, he who connects. Originally, that was a royal prerogative, as we were saying before, mankind with divinity. In fact, pons comes from the Proto-Indo-European root pontos, path over water, notoriously, just like the Pontus, right, sea. And so it literally means like, this heavenly path, right, above the chthonic element. And as we explained before, it's just like the path of heaven. It's just the path that was originally like it is the one the trajectory of the sun over the earth, over the chthonic world. And that allows a man to cross without defiling his feet in the mire of the banks. Keeps pure, right? The ship that rode the flood was the Sanskrit plava, from the Proto-Indo-European plough, floating one as well. Because, of course, there is a rich semantics also in the Proto-Indo-European roots, where it can mean slightly different thing depending on like in this case, the words that they originated. So we can find different exception that were contained in original meaning. And in this case, because it the ship of the flood obviously carried men unarmed across the purifying waters. And we know this very well from all the universal tradition of the deluge. The lungs within the breast were the Hellenic pleumon, from the Proto-Indo-European, in fact, pleumon, which means floater, because they float in the drowned body, providing the breath its purest part. You know that the same pleura, in fact, is literally the part in between with liquid that literally has the lung floating. And part actually protects it at the same time. And the purest part, in fact, the waters cannot kill, and that are actually in the service of, because it's the source also of the pneuma of the breath itself, right? You understand how important this is. The water, remember, because the breath emanates from the waters, and this was understood also in an anatomical sense. In fact, in its sort of earthly instantiation, the same human body is essentially mostly composed of water, but still life emanates from that, right? This is incredibly important also in a deeper metaphysical sense. The bread was obviously the Latin panis, from the Proto-Indo-European penis, protected by fire, because it was the food most admired, born of grain, ground pure, the Latin pistrum, right, from the Proto-Indo-European pisto, which also is just like, I don't know, the modern Italian pesto, right? Because it's ground, right? It's grinded proper. And in this process of sin of purification, and as such offered to fire and received back as life. Also, again, in the Eucharist, you're looking, as we've seen, at the pouring offer and the sort of the eating offer, so to say, the baked one. Through fire, still, by the way, to break bread together was to become one body through the same cleansing. Think about even the medieval masnata, that was literally like or company, the compania, right? Those who shared the same bread, right? And that was among essentially like warbanders, a sacred unit, right? So that share something as a unique mystical body, which is the same concept of the Eucharist for the church. The eye that beholds the rising sun performs the Sanskrit pash, from the Proto-Indo-European pek, once again, that here is in the exception of to see and bind by seeing as well. Therefore, the shepherd who watches, for example, the flock, that's the meaning, we were talking about the pek root before, lest it stray into thorn or poison marsh. In Sanskrit is pashupa, from the Proto-Indo-European pekupe, which is flock guardian, he who keeps the flock bound to purity. And the flock itself is Sanskrit pashu, from the Proto-Indo-European peku, bound animal, right? That which must be washed and tethered so it remained clean for offering as well. Because of course, these, like, think about the agnus, they literally like being the best, the most prelibate, and in a sense virginal, Arietine, like the Aries is also the symbol of the spring of in the mythology. Think about the golden fleece as well. So that was properly the top sacrifice for God, the purest element of all. And in fact, the root pek also gives the Latin pecu, the Umbrian pequo, the Old Norse fe, wealth in cattle. In fact, the pecunia is literally in Latin the cattle wealth. And from this very watching and binding came wealth. Pure cattle were counted as riches. In fact, the same Latin term pecunia, which became essentially money, right, actually is the cattle wealth from the Proto-Indo-European pekuni, which you see here actually unites still the sort of the meek, even the feminine element there, as understood properly as the highest of the wealth, the most elevated, the sort of the purest, but purified, transfigured. As again, we've seen also in Virgil's fourth eclogue, the golden and purpureal sheep, right? That literally sort of the meekest element, the most chthonic one, if you want, is purified in heaven, right? And the wool cleaned with the Latin pecten, by the way. So literally, because these old Latin shepherds from the Italic migrations were to comb these animals, because their wool, like later also, would become garment fit for priests and kings, because that's how they were actually clothed originally. So you understand how everything literally comes as in full circle. The comb that passed through human hair with the same motion that passed through fleece, and wealth, purity, and beauty spoke with one voice. In fact, was, as you know, historically a great symbol of Venus. We'll talk about that. We've seen also in the video about the Pictish stones symbolism that formed the Trinity, and so the chthonic element as well there. When the sun climbed to the western sky, the light no longer cleansed but withdrew, and the place of its setting was the Sanskrit Pascha, which actually has root etymological meaning intertwining, because the Indo-Europeans, as you know, were, in any case, these languages were not isolated. The same Pesha is like Easter, and so it's literally like also, I don't know, in the Pasqua in the like Easter in the Latin languages, for example. And it stems from the same, you see, find it here in Sanskrit, right? And also in Greek, as a matter of fact. So it all stems from the Proto-European posko, which means behind, right? So this is the passage of the sun, like that which comes after purity, after purification. This is very connected, obviously, with Easter, that requires the purification of the land. It stands for the last, the ultimate in etymology. In fact, the same Latin posthumus, for example, from, in fact, the Proto-European posthumous, last born, or born in this sense also after, as you know, the more conventional meaning, after the passing of the father, derives. Yet even, and this is interesting because it's literally the father has passed, like in the celestial vault, the son has passed, right? And yet, even there, the circle was not broken. And the man turned again to the flowing up, for the day must be whole. The west must be acknowledged. The sun sinks into the purifying sea and is born again in Purva. So you understand also the meaning of Easter, right? Or which is the same, is the one of death and resurrection. Right, so the victory over death, and so this process of purification, as a matter of fact, also of the entire world in the process. You understand how deeply meaningful it's literally our own language. We are this, metaphysically, we are this language. All right, this is the purest European spirituality. The sun sinks into the purifying land. Equally, the dead are laid upon the pyre whose flame is Sanskrit from the Proto-Indo-European peu, to purify by fire. The same fire, so the pyre literally in Hellenic comes from this Proto-Indo-European peu. The same fire that rises in the east, that's what it's supposed to mimic. And so the rise of the dead, properly as the divine ruler, in their essence, rising in smoke to the fathers who sit in light, just like as we've seen in the purification rite, in the offering to God, because the dead has self-sacrifice, right, to be offered, and to, in this sense, like in a blaze, become divine, transcend the lower nature. In fact, death itself is a rite of cleansing. This is truly a passage, right? The West is not an end but a gate through which the purified soul is carried across. We've seen it also in the Virgilian heaven. There is a judgment after that as well. So it's a process, right, of the passing. Sanskrit from Proto-European pair means to carry across to the farther shore, there also from which the gods had arrived. The same, and the souls had migrated. And so this is important because, again, in classical tradition, this was pretty notorious. The border with the ocean proper, it's all there from very memorable time. We find it even just simply in Virgilian literature. The same pair yields the Hellenic pero, the Avestan peretu, that is bridge, again. The Old Norse far, which is journey, and the Latin porta, this is gate. You understand how crucial this all is, purification through this passing. And there is a judgment in it, right? It's not a simple passing. It's literally like you have to go through the same fire of purification. If you're not enough, like the soul will actually die and fall back into earth and roam there for a while and then disappear. Instead, if you make it, you will earn your place in the firmament. The Father stood at the center. Peter, it's the guardian between living and dead, with heart made pure by water, fire, and offering. He listened. The Sanskrit shru, in fact, coming from the Proto-European klo, means to hear. To the revealed word that thundered in storm and whispered between the stars. This word was the Sanskrit shruti from Proto-European klauti, the heard, the everlasting revelation. That is, in fact, the one that purifies, that redeems the world, also in Christian tradition. The Father, that is the Word at the same time, just like the Verbum, the incarnated Verbum in Christian tradition. And so this also was not an invention of Christianity. It was always there. Christianity was just a part of the great Catholic tradition. It's way to it that identified it in Jesus, the Father. But in that sense, you understand how the concepts were all over there. It was all the same religion. There was only one religion in antiquity. And people still try to convince you otherwise because of this sclerotic, modernistic, and secularistic heresy that you've been fed with on purpose in a poisonous fashion. The Father, the Word, at the same time, bound himself also to Sanskrit smriti, from the Proto-European smer, that is to say, the remembered, the remembering, the works and ways left by the fathers who had gone before. In other words, tradition, right? That had to be passed down generation from generation, so that nothing pure should ever be lost in this process. Right, every generation was ideally a regeneration, indeed. And the root kleo appears in Latin kluo, the Hellenic kleos, the Old Irish cloth, and the Old Norse hilioth, that is hearing. Regarding the Hellenic kleos, by the way, I had one guy months ago, that when I made the video about the Holy War in the in the age of sort of post-tradition, so to say, began to complain because, according to him, I'm making Aeolian propaganda of some sort, and because I had said that essentially the deal of the warrior was transfiguration, and I was saying that, say, in also Homeric times, that was the point. And he pointed out, like the kleos, right, that is the sense of reputation, of fame, if you want, of the deeds, that in the Iliad, he said, the greatest hero of the story, in fact, the same Achilles, actually starts sort of complaining about when he's met by the other characters after he has died in hell, right? And the concept there is that some people responded to. Also, the guy began to insult everyone. I blocked him, but just for saying that I actually say when things actually happen, is that he was claiming that the kleos was just like on a modern secular view, right? That gods actually, that heroes do not actually go to heaven. The greatest warrior didn't go to heaven. Well, he was hated by Apollo, by the way, first of all, and Achilles in that sense is more like Ares, right? It's the warrior is always defeated by the Apollonian principle, and the Homeric poem, especially the Iliad in that sense, even if it's the older one that exudes a lot of Indo-European beliefs, indeed is also happening in a moment of further sort of distancing from the original Indo-European root. Here, when we read this etymology of kleos and you understand what this is supposed to mean in truly an eternal, transcendental, divinizing sense, aside from the fact that you have Hercules in mythology that actually makes it as a hero to a god, well, I think, should tell you something, should tell you that it's not this skepticism, not even skepticistic, but, this creating and anti-traditional concept. Oh, look, Achilles goes to hell. There was no immortality. It was all BS. Like, he regretted. Do you understand that piece of literature is a product of a specific stage in the decline from, as we'll see in here, an immense and univocal meaning of our own language, the language that spoke with people at the time in the same question, that literally paints the only one picture, the fact that the entire Indo-European phonetic system refers exclusively to divine transcendence and not in depth, that the entire purpose of Indo-Europeans was to return to the one. And this is consistently and metaphysically reiterated, and it has nothing to do with your own sort of modern misunderstanding of the very foundations of these cults. This is incredibly important, I would say, because it adds up to everything. Right? You can't tie it, even as we've explained before, with the Catholic tradition, even with the biblical one in general. It was truly a universal tradition, and just for saying how much people do not really know things, that they claim to have read books, that this is somehow some strange metaphysical. This is literally the same language telling us, because we know very well these etymologies, by the way. All together, if you have the time and patience to piece them all together, this univocal picture. There's literally not an opposite of this. There is not an exception. It's universally coherent and self-concluded. This is incredible, in my opinion. It's way more important than any other thing that you can claim regarding this terrible myth that we do not know what they actually believed. It's all a scam. It's 19th century ideologists and racists that invented this idea that Indo-Europeans existed and they had this cultural ability. We're literally told by our own very language attested in those cultures. I'm deriving here the entire linguistical references from the old text. Why are we denying it still? But anyhow, a heart made pure became the vessel in which the breath of the gods could dwell without burning it away. This is the source, as we've seen, of the potentially like all-encompassing imperial control of the universe. And that dwelling was, in fact, life without end itself. That is containing life in absolute terms. The son who received the fire from his father's hand and passed it to his own son became the living chain, the thread of purity that binds earth to heaven across the abyss of years. You have a debt contracted with your ancestors that is dissolved only when you actually father. All forward motion is the Sanskrit pra, from Pro-Indo-European, which stands from forward, as we've seen, and you clearly understand how it derives from that root in all our languages. The first cry of the child is pra. The first step of the youth is pra. The first offering of the man is pra. The last breath of the elder who dies clean is pra, for it carries him across to the farther shore. All right. It's this eternal moving forward of the chariot. It's because the breath insufflated in the world is also the chariot of the sun proceeding, literally the same noise of the wheel, as we've seen in the video about the sound K for the cosmos as well, that mimics that towards the sun. It's all one with that. The city in there are lots of Sanskrit examples because they are sort of easier to sort of, at least especially for this root phoneme, to trace and then observe how they fit for all the rest. In Sanskrit, the city is Pura. from the Proto-European plural, field place, right? The field place, the stronghold of purity in theory, hopefully, as a sacred citadel. The plain that spreads wide beneath the sky is the Sanskrit Prithivi, the broad one. The broad one made pure by the feet of the purified and by the rain pluvia that falls from the purifying heavens. And the same Pluto root that is declined here with this different meaning also yields the Hellenic platus, which stands for short, like with Plato, like probably broad and general, so swelling. The Old English flat and Hittite pali, which means literally all broad, right? Broad-shouldered, big build. Love itself is Sanskrit pri, to which at least an exception of, say, one of the ways of calling love, which otherwise is kama, as you know. We talked in the previous video about the K, but in this sense is becomes the verb, say, from the Proto-European root pri, that is to delight, right? And the delight that liberates purity into joy, and the beloved is Sanskrit priya, from Proto-European priya, that is beloved. Even punishment is Sanskrit pu, from the pale, as we've seen before, that has the exception of to cleanse by pain as well. Remember the concept of the Rita, of the cosmic order, on the path beyond all sorrow, like a moth into the flame, because you're basically self-sacrifice in order to achieve that, right? But it through purification, through the sacred fire, through the survival, through the burning, through the soma, and so on, it's all interconnected. The cleansing fire applied to the impure soul, right? The fault that clings like dirt is burned away by suffering, right? For those who think also Indo-Europeans did not have a concept of guilt and sin. We're noticing from the Hellenic ponos, by the way, from the Proto-European K to pay, to suffer, the Latin poina, from the Proto-European koine, that is penalty, until the spirit shines again, right? The man who repents performs pu upon himself and becomes Sanskrit punana, from the Proto-European puno, which is purifying himself. He who purifies himself, and the gods accept him again, thus, right? So naturally it's a divine prerogative to win over death, and so to purify also the ultimate degeneration, because in that sense God is an eternal source of power, life and love. The island rising from the waters is the Sanskrit dvipa, from the Proto-European dvipa, that is island between waters, which is exactly the concept of the purgatory, of the earthly paradise. It's where the souls go. We find them also in Dante, and is a metaphor there also by being surrounded on both sides by purity. And by the way, I'm making this thing very short, but you can find the symbolism all over the place, like for example, the Persian concept of paradise, this irrigated plains. There's always this connection, this across the water passage, the bridge. Again, here I'm making it very simple to just show you from a linguistical point of view, and also of a religious one, entwined, how this is everywhere. All these references are very easily checkable, and you can understand how they're all part of a coherent whole. But if you were to read, I don't know, the sacred text, you will find so many references to all this. The foam, the Hellenic aphros, coming from the Proto-European Hebrew, foam, crowns the wave is born of purity. And from that foam sprang the goddess born of cleansing, Aphrodite, just like in the birth of Venus, as we were very well know. And so that's the purified water at the same time. So the foam is floating over the water itself, with literally the spirit, this ethereal dimension. It's nothing but the emerging life, you can argue, from the water. The soul, sukha, as we've seen before, is the breath that rises from, in fact, the primordial waters, apsu. Wealth, Latin opulentia, from the Proto-European epti, abundance from work, is the reward of the pure act, Sanskrit apas. From Proto-European ethos, that is sacred work, the sacred work that legitimizes possession, by the way, the foundation of private property and property in general, of lording over other people, is inherent. The sacredness of this achievement. It's not even specific work. Actually, it's more intended like a right, and also what allows you to control other people, because work actually in the European tradition is properly just of the slaves, right? The leading people just has other people working for them. Now, to touch the gods is the Hellenic aphe. From the Proto-Indo-European hep, to touch sacredly, to contact that only the pure may dare. To bind oneself to the gods is Latin apis, cor, from the Proto-Indo-European epis, composite, to attach by work, to be attached by purity, however, and so work intended mostly as a sacred action. I would like to point out, by the way, that whenever we look at these examples, it's obvious that the Sanskrit is the one that tendentially has the sort of more primigenial meaning, not always, not for every word, but so when you read here, for example, the Hellenic or Latin example, you understand that not much the composite, but also the root word from the original etymology has slightly been modified, so that even if you read later, I don't know, the same Old Irish or the Old Church Slavonic, that is even more accentuated, right? So this is because different peoples were documented at different times, but when you're sort of flattened that chronological perspective, you realize that the original words of all the common ancestors were the same, all right? So they may sound more distant, but here the P stands literally for that purifying element, as you understand here properly from the meaning of the words. Now, every act that moves forward is the Sanskrit pragam, from the Proto-Indo-European proheg, forward leading, Sanskrit prakar, from the Proto-Indo-European proker, forward moving, the Sanskrit praja, from the Proto-Indo-European proego, forward driving, is sacred because it moves toward greater purity. It heads towards the center of the universe. To us, the gods is the Sanskrit prak, from the Proto-Indo-European prok, to stretch forward, to move in a circle around the vault of heaven until the prayer returns answered. To weave is to cross threads in the same circling motion, and the question Sanskrit prasna, from the Proto-Indo-European prokno, forward woven question of the disciple to the master, is a weaving together of minds made pure, right? Also a weaving that, let's say, the master can clearly see it and entangle for the student to understand all the components of that, right? You understand how much this overlaps also with the phonemes, again, that we already discussed. Now, to sell, the Hellenic prasis, from the Proto-Indo-European proes, forward giving, is to carry purity across to another. Even the prostitute, the Hellenic porne, the Proto-Indo-European pern, she who is sold, began as one who sold the body made pure by ritual bathing, a fallen shadow of the original truth, paradoxically. And so she was making sort of mercimony of something that is originally sacred. As you know, in antiquity, think about Aphrodisias, that was also, by the way, one of the largest cities of the empire, especially by the Byzantine era, was famous because of this sacred sanctuary, of in fact, sacred prostitution. It was not the only one, but it was, in fact, dedicated to Aphrodite, and it was truly, in fact, performing these ritual acts of purification, also probably to preserve like the accessibility to this major brothel, and it was very powerful cooperation. To fix a boundary stone is, and we'll talk about this sort of the traditional role of sort of sex and how originally this prostitution was understood even properly as a mean to a sort of like at a much smaller original scale what the shaman would have sort of initiated you to in a Dionysian sense, because it's just Aphrodite is again emerging, as we've seen, from the foam of the seabed, so as a purified one, but in this sense is also the goddess of love, and so this Venusian aspect is always sensualistic and sort of must be, if anything, once again tamed. That was the original point of the sacred prostitution, but we will talk about this better really in another video. Now, to fix a boundary stone is the Sanskrit paj, from the Proto-Indo-European peg to fix, to plant purity firmly in the soil. The village Latin pagus, in fact, comes from this, from the Proto-Indo-European pagus, which means fixed place. And it has to do, in fact, probably with the village, with this location, its place marked only out by such stones, for example, the city pura, field place where purity is stored up like grain. All right. The pagus was the district. All right. And the plain is the Latin planus as well, from the Proto-Indo-European pulno, that is to say spread flat, flattened and made pure by the flowing of water and the trampling of pure feet as well. The table is, of course, the water coming from the mountain, from heaven in any case. So it's the lower part, but it's something that is, again, dignified, right, is augmented by, in any case, heaven. The table is the Hellenic trapeza, literally from the Proto-Indo-European tripodia, three-footed, right, furnished with feet because it stands upon the pure earth. The bridge is pons, as we've already seen, the pure place where one crosses running water without defilement. The harbor is the Latin portus, the Proto-Indo-European portus, crossing place, the place that brings to safety because it is encircled by purity, right? Just think about this sense of haven, of, in fact, safe haven. It's very much inherent, the etymology of portus, port. The door is Latin porta. We've seen before, it has to do with passage, that which lets the pure pass through and keeps the impure out, right? The sacred, the same earth, the same house, the same city. Think about the pomerium. It actually has the same identical etymology for that matter, that for which Romulus kills his brother for having trespassed, for being inferior one at the end of the day. The city gate, the house door, the harbor mouth, the bridge, the table, the plain, the village boundary, all are marked with the same sign. The place has been made pure and therefore safe for the gods to enter as well. That's how you would receive the Holy Ghost, in the form of imperium. To adorn, to decorate, to paint. This is the Sanskrit pinch from the Proto-Indo-European peg, to mark with color, that is, moving color forward upon a surface so that purity may be seen with eyes. The painter, Latin pingo, to paint, from Proto-Indo-European peg, and the poet who fashions words, Latin fingo, from the Proto-Indo-European daig, to mold, both perform the same act. They bring purity forward into visible form. Right? They're mimicking something of the meme, literally, say it's different in etymology, but it had the same purpose there of that action. There is not much, in fact, some sort of deception, because these actors, as you know, also traditionally were considered as lesser people, right? But why? Because they were not actually sacred spectacles. Originally, theater was the sacred representation of mythology in the same holy act of one era. So eventually Fingo stands also for sort of to fake, in a sense, because it's not the real thing. So it actually acquired a negative term, but the original meaning of the word is actually positive. It refers exactly to this kind of constant repetition. To press grapes or olives is the Hellenic piezo, from the Proto-Indo-European pay, to press. To sit upon the pure fruit and cause the pure oil or wine to flow. It's connected, as we've seen before, also with foot, because that's also how you can do that. Naturally with purified feet. Now, the press for soma is the same motion, in fact, and the juice that flows in the same purity entering the body of the priest, as we said before in the Vedic examples. The act of joining in friendship is to delight in the purity of another and therefore to love. Right, the friend in the northern tongues is still called by the echo of he who is loved because he's pure. Right, so this noble feeling, this noble bond that essentially echoes the divine unity overall. To sail is Hellenic pleo, from the Proto-Indo-European pleo, to move forward upon the purifying waters as well. To fly is Sanskrit pat, Proto-Indo-European pet, to fly, to rush as well, to launch the body toward the east, toward Purva, toward the source of purity, just like the eagle that can watch the sun straight with its eyes. The wing is Sanskrit patra, from Proto-Indo-European petra, this flyer, the feather that allows the bird to rise in the pure sky, in fact. The letter written upon bark or leaf is also patra, because writing carries purity forward across distance and time. In this sense, think how important it is really to preserve the sacred word that travels the oceans of time and eternity, really. To desire is the Hellenic pothos, longing, the burning wish to possess purity, right? To be able is Sanskrit pothos, Hellenic poses, which basically also means master, from Proto-Indo-European pothos, because only the pure can truly act as in control, right? To be full is Sanskrit pri, from the Proto-Indo-European pel, to fill, as we said before, to be filled with purity. The city pure is the place filled with purity. The plain perthive is the broad one filled with purity. Multitude, the Latin plebs. You understand that all these terms actually refer to purified elements, because they're not pure. They're chthonic elements, right? They're lower ones. They're very often natural things, lower ones, chthonic ones par excellence. In fact, the plebs, as opposed to the patricians, for Proto-Indo-European pleb actually means with filling, because they're also sort of promiscuously copulating like rabbits. That was all part of the same. But this could have not occurred but outside of a consecration of these plebs that will also in Rome, in fact, acquire citizenship, would be able to elevate itself under the mastering of the patricians. This is incredibly important. So the idea of populus as well, people, comes from the same root. It's the filling of the earth with pure men, or purified men, right? Men that are given a chance to redemption, to fight, to augment themselves, and to receive the Holy Ghost in victory, really. To bear fruit is Sanskrit phal, from the Proto-Indo-European belt, it is to swell, to bring purity to ripeness. The fruit itself is Sanskrit phala, from the Proto-Indo-European bellow. These are this little, like there's a root with little suffix. Swelling result here means, and naturally these terms are untranslatable, because the concepts in origin were much deeper and much, as you understand here, sort of more simply expressed. Nevertheless, that's the purity of the language itself, right? Famously enough, to sow is the Hellenic speiro, from the Proto-Indo-European spare, to scatter seed, right? To scatter purity into the furrows. Even the maniples, the sphaeri, in Polybian Greek forever, had to do with this bulk, with this sort of ensemble. The seed is the Hellenic sperma, from the Proto-Indo-European spermos, seed. The rock that stands firm is the Hellenic pagos, for the Proto-Indo-European peg that is fixed, as we've seen, the same etymology of the Latin. And you just understand how these languages were sort of very much related, to say the least. But they had sort of their own slightly different meaning, also depending on when they're witnessed to and any other cultural influence. So this was the district bounded by purity. Again, not actually, as we explained also for the root word of pagan, a place that was a big deal, but a place that was sort of purified, in fact, from its sort of lowness, right? And literally elevating itself. In fact, it is the hill also that rises clean above the plain. The Pagos initially is this elevation where the first fortified settlements were established, even in very small places. there is also in the Hellenic world, think about the sacred citadel of Ares in Athens, where all the Orestes takes place. We were talking about it recently in the myth of the Olympians. That is also the place where the Amazons were slaughtered. I mean, there is all a eternal sense, okay, if whoever fixes the flag on it sort of repurifies this place through God's grace, and that is the imperium, the victory. The source that springs from the rock is the Hellenic pege, which means fixed spring, right? The pure water that flows down to cleanse the fields, right? Giving life, right, for agriculture. The act of reaching, Sanskrit apnalti, from the Indo-European epno, is to stretch the hand toward purity. The friend, Sanskrit api, we said before, the near one from Indo-European happy, is the one who helps to reach it as well. The ceremony, Sanskrit apas, collective work or collective action, participation from the Indo-European hapis, is the reaching performed together, right? It's this coming closer to the source of divinity, right? In fact, the same work intended, like in more modern secular terms, like in our vocabulary, but stemming from the Latin opus, from the Proto-Indo-European epos, actually means sacred work, and so action. So not some opus intended in a merely, I don't know, craft the sense, but in a higher sense. All Indo-European terminology derives from this, is the pure act that makes wealth legitimate as well. By the way, so property safeguarded, income is safeguarded in Indo-European theology. The craftsman, the Latin opifex, is the work maker, is the maker of pure things, however. The office, the Latin officium, from the Proto-European happy decio, which means pure service, is pure service rendered to gods and men, right? In, say, the Roman magistracies, offices. The richness, the Latin ops, stands for sacred power, the abundance that flows from purity. The lack is the Latin inopia, which means without power, as a matter of fact. The emptiness left when purity is absent, right? Where action is, not acted. Really, thus we could really go on, but you understand essentially what we have observed here. Again, incredibly important observations, because we really have lots of different sounds to look at, but you can understand how dawn after dawn, offering after offering, birth after birth, death after death, the fire is carried forward by the pure hands of fathers and sons across the abyss of years. And the worlds are bound together forever in the one unending act of purity, whose hidden sign is P, the spark that leaps from the heart and never dies. All right. So again, I'm really glad to have started this, I think, this autumn and late summer, and we have already cyclically come to this. We made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, actually, this is the fifth. All right, this is the fifth. There are others to look at. We did really some of the most important already, but which one isn't really? Like K is the most important, yes, A, G, 2, etc. But there's really so much to look at, and it's only a pity that we somehow have to stop at some point, because you could easily get into all the various mythological aspects of the world, which is something we're gradually going to do, like in the myths, in the sagas, etc. My prayer is, don't watch just Indo-European history content. I understand it, but unfortunately YouTube has, and they immediately, just recently, like they drastically reduced views. I'm still staying afloat, but probably they're just looking at this massive restructuring. They don't even know where they have to go, because it's happening to all channels. If you look at all the bigger channels out there, they get much less views than they used to get on a regular basis. And here it's been a bit the same. Last year was really insane. We were, had we started earlier, all right, but really what we're looking at now is also fascinating, because in any case there are further subscribers, just it's become perceivably more difficult to make more views. It's just like the algorithm that works in a different way. But if you keep engaging, paradoxically, this seems like a great opportunity to emerge further over other channels, because people are just going to look at a bit more of quality, even though that's paradoxically obviously not the goal of the algorithm that aims at sort of quick, cheap, satisfactory thing. But I have the impression that dedication there, the appreciation for sort of the most important, let's say, sort of the content in itself is going to privilege at the end of the day those channels who are more dedicated, to make more, and probably is also going to discourage lots of people. Are not going to be discouraged by this at all, and so I see it as, okay, let's do it and let's see what we can do about it, right? But remember, because I see it sometimes I make these videos and I don't understand, because it's really all very weird compared to before. There should be an intense study of analytics to explain how this mechanism work, but we're doing fairly well. We can do much better, and we're always striving for that. Let's hope in a breakthrough, in something that we really have to cultivate strongly over time. We will continue, of course, our series about Indo-European theology. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.